Hi, folks. So we're going to start on chapter 12. And what we've covered so far, I've mentioned that Darwin had two great ideas. Descent from a common ancestor, which was what we've been covering for the most part. In other words, homology, why we have four limbs. We have the same bones on our four limbs as all tetrapod vertebrates. Vestigial traits, all that kind of stuff. But now we're going to get to the actual process by which evolution results in adaptive evolution. In other words, where an organism and its traits become better fit to the environment that it's living in compared to individuals who don't have that trait. But there's also more to evolution than that, but that's where we're going to start. So evolution by natural selection is a process. It was first proposed by Darwin, but he didn't write about it. It wasn't until Alfred Russel Wallace came along about 20 years later and sent him a paper, then they both published their work. But Darwin definitely came up with the idea initially, and he got the idea from a number of different things. So we're going to start this by going over a few things. Okay, you can read this. This is on the origin of species, the last paragraph of the book. It's kind of a nice quote, but we're going to go on. Okay, so Darwin is known for descent with modification. So what does descent from modification mean? Well, descend, that means from common ancestry. Okay, but what is modification? Well, that's the process. In this case, modification that gives an organism and populations an advantage in that they're better fit to the environment. And so we'll call this evolution by natural selection. Okay, so the species descend with modification from an ancestor, descend from a common ancestor, and species that have a common ancestor, now they might not have changed all that much, but we'll assume that they've changed enough so that they're, we'll say, reproductively isolated. But so different species arise from common ancestry, and the new species are adapted to their own specific environment. So we know that modern organisms have descended from pre-existing life forms. We all share the same DNA. And we know there's lots of evidence for that from fossil record and all that. We know new species arise from previous species. What's the cause of this change? Are there other causes of evolutionary change? So, what's the cause of the change? We're going to deal with natural selection right now, but there are other causes as well. And when evolution by natural selection happens, remember it's the population that actually changes, not the individual. So an individual is strictly like someone who's been dealt cards. Let's say you get dealt 2 8s and someone else gets dealt a full house. Who wins? The full house. You don't change your cards. Those are the ones that you brought to the table. Whether they're a winning or a losing hand relative to other hands is a matter of whether you are an evolutionary winner. In other words, leaving more offspring than other variants. Okay, and evolutionary change occurs when allele frequencies, remember those things? Alleles, frequencies, or the frequency of a trait in a population change over time. Okay? So we're going to go into that specifically. Okay. So this is Darwin's second great idea. Got lots of evidence, the theory of evolution, and all these things that go with it. Okay, so an overview. Evolution by natural selection occurs when random mutation creates heritable genetic variation. So we're going to learn you need to meet certain requirements to have evolution by natural selection. For one thing, you need variation. You need variation in the phenotype, and then selection works on that. Who has the best trait in terms of phenotype for the environment that organism is living in? Okay, where does that variation ultimately come from? It comes from random mutation. Okay, and we know how mutations happen. We've gone over it in previous chapters, but here we go. We've got some DNA replication. There's a mistake that wasn't corrected. That creates a mutation. Okay. Mutations are random. It's not like you can hope that make a good mutation versus a bad mutation. They're strictly random, whether they're good, bad, or have no effect at all. Okay? Now, it turns out that most mutations have no effects or lower fitness. In other words, they reduce adaptation. They reduce an organism's success by coding for proteins that aren't the original proteins but are dysfunctional, let's say. And we've gone over that, point mutations and all that, where you get a difference in the protein made, the protein doesn't function properly. Now, mutations that cause problems are much more common, because if you think about it, you have one letter change and you get a different amino acid, and it's likely to make the protein not function as well as it used to. Once in a while, you'll get a variant where it actually functions better. But beneficial mutations are rare, and they certainly don't occur because an organism needs them. They happen randomly. Now, some individuals have adaptive alleles or trait variants that confer higher relative fitness, and we're going to talk about what fitness is in a bit. Relative fitness, and fitness, by the way, is the currency by which evolution happens, okay, in terms of adaptive evolution. In other words, a population becoming better fit to its environment over time, okay? And so it's like, who has the most dollars? That's the currency, okay, compared to those without those alleles or without those phenotypic variants that make them better adapted to the environment. Okay. We've gone over this slide before, but we're going to start again just to give ourselves a refresher course. Okay, what's a population? A group of individuals of the same species. Okay, and in that group they can interbreed successfully and all that kind of stuff. Now, the population is actually what becomes adapted. In other words, what evolves. An individual does not. Now, in the population, individuals in a diploid organization, they have a gene pool. In other words, all the population, and they each have two alleles. They could be the same allele or two different alleles, because they're diploid. And if you took all those alleles and threw them into a pot, and then randomly chose, and from those you created an offspring. So let's take a look at this. Okay. Now, also, a few things. What's an allele? It's a variant of a gene. In this case, we've got two alleles. We've got A1 and we've got A2. Okay. And what else do we have? What is a genotype? Well, since they're diploid, let's say we have a situation where there's two alleles, like I pointed out, you can end up with three distinct genotypes. You can have two of the same allele, A1 and A1, and that is going to have a phenotype of blue. You can also have a genotype of A2. These are homozygotes. And we're going to say it translates directly into a phenotype of, in this case, orange or yellow. And then you can have a heterozygote genotype, right? And this is one allele of each, A1, A2. In this case, we have incomplete dominance, where we get some kind of expression that mixes the two together. So we now have a genotype that is A1 and A2, and in this case, it's green. So now we have chickens. We can see this is the whole population, by the way. This is the population. You can figure out what the frequencies are, but you can see up above, it says there's 50% A1, A1, 50% A2, A2. 25% A1, A1, 25% A2, A2, that's 50%, and then 50% A1, A2. Okay, that's the population. Now, the gene pool, like I talked about a little earlier up here, right? The gene pool are, all these chickens make gametes. The gametes are haploid. They either, if it's a male chicken, it gives you sperm. A female chicken gives you eggs. You take all those alleles, each person has two alleles for each gene, and you throw them into the pot, and this is what you get in terms of the gene pool. Okay? There are twice as many alleles in the gene pool as there are individual chickens in this population. Because remember, each chicken is diploid and it has two alleles for every gene. Then, in breeding, we assume random mating, and so we purposely, let's say, pick out one allele, take this allele, and we take this allele. That means we take an A1 and an A2, okay? The A2 is this one, A1 is this one, and we're going to end up with a green chick, which is then again diploid. Okay, so there. Now remember we've got genotypes. Those are the actual alleles, the combination of alleles that an individual has if they're diploid. And we also have the alleles themselves, and by the way, each individual gamete has one of these alleles. In other words, it's either an A1 or it's an A2. Okay, now, eventually you make the assumption that alleles code for proteins, and proteins affect traits or make traits. That's the genotype, what an organism looks like, its anatomy, physiology, behavior, how it develops. all these kinds of different things. That's the phenotype. Now, it turns out the phenotype is actually a combination of the genes and the environment. Okay, and we'll get to that a little bit later, how genes and environment always interact. It's not like genes code for a certain trait. They code for a certain trait in terms of the environment that they're in. Okay, now, so the essence of evolution is that new variants, in this case coming from mutation, okay, enter the population. They mix and match up in the population. Some of those variants disappear, either because selection does not favor them. They're not good mutations. They're not good. They don't give you good genotypes or phenotypes, or they're randomly lost. And so over time, you end up at a different time period. The old variants, some of those old genes or alleles or traits go extinct. Okay? Some are lost immediately because they're not favorable mutations. Okay. Now, this causes the population, remember the population is the thing that's changing. It causes allele frequencies and the phenotypes that are associated with them to fluctuate. Okay? And this is called microevolution. Okay. Now, allele frequencies are calculated as percentages of a population. Okay? So allele frequencies, percentages of a specific allele in a population. What you do is in this case, let's say we wanted to actually count or calculate percentages of a population. We've got two alleles. We've got, we'll say, big A and little a. And big A is dark allele, black allele, and little a is a white allele. And so we can see we've got individual mice here. This one up here is big A, little a, as far as the genotype. Just like this. We've got other genotypes like this, AA, like that. And then we've got little a, like that. Okay. So each individual mouse has two alleles. Let's count up the mice. One, we'll go from the bottom, or let's go from the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, this is not going to work. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 mice for a total of 30 alleles. Okay? So that's 30 alleles. Now, the question is how many, the frequency of the alleles are, how many big A alleles are there? Well, if we count out the mice that are black, that's big A, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 7 times 2 is 14. Okay. And then we've also got 2 mice, 3 mice that have, that are big A, little a. So there's 3 more. So that gives you 14 plus 3 is 57, is 17. So we've got 17 over 30. And if you do the white ones, you end up with 13 over 30. And now what do we have? We have exactly 57% big A, or big A, and 43% little a. Okay? Hopefully you can get that. We can go over this. You can go over this yourself. What would the white fur pigment allele frequency be if 3 of the homozygous black mice were heterozygous? Well, you can figure that out yourself. Okay, so we're going to concentrate on natural selection, but there are more forces that change allele frequencies or trait frequencies in a population than just natural selection. Okay? In fact, we're going to go over them. First of all, there's natural selection. This is natural selection and sexual selection, which is a specific type of natural selection that affects how lucky you are or how good you are at getting mates and creating offspring. Those two forces end up giving you adaptive evolution, where individuals who have the good traits survive and reproduce better. They have higher fitness than individuals that don't have those alleles or beneficial traits. And so they leave more of their offspring and more of their genes into future generations. Now, there are also these other forces. There is mutation. Mutation by itself, we're going to see, is very weak. But when you combine it with natural selection, it becomes very strong, because mutation gives you the variation that you need for natural selection to actually operate. Then there is something called genetic drift, which has to do with population size. So if you had an infinitely large population, you would have no drift, but genetic drift, you can randomly, with regard to fitness, in other words, whether it's good or bad or indifferent, you can randomly increase in frequency of certain alleles or decrease in frequency. Has nothing to do with natural selection. You also have something called non-random mating, where mates they choose, instead of randomly picking and mating, you'd have individuals that might, let's say, might choose like. And then that'll change frequencies of genotypes. And then there's something called migration or gene flow, okay, or dispersal. And that also will change frequencies. And migration is generally, well, we'll get to that, but it's not, it's generally random as well. So remember, forces that change the allele frequencies in a population over time, that is what we call evolution. Not just evolution by natural selection, but evolution in general. Change in allele frequencies or trait frequencies. Okay. So we talked a little bit about this, selective breeding. So this is all example of different kinds of selective breeding, whether it's for tomatoes. These are people who've bred tomatoes. They want them to have certain traits. Dogs, the same thing. Some of this artificial selection that we talk about, in some cases people purposely breed that way, but in other cases, just by the fact that they are cultivating things, they might change the way populations change without them actually realizing what they're doing. Okay, so, and then other things like sheep and pigeons and all that. This is what the evolution of corn happened, the ancestor of corn. Teosinte, it's found in Mexico, the Central Highlands. It's very small kernels, but because of domestication over time, over the last 10,000 years, from selective breeding, whether the people who were actually planting it were thinking about it purposely or not, eventually they ended up with larger and larger kernels on the cob. And so you can see Mexico, then what happened in Europe. Eventually we've got these hybrids that we now see today. Okay. This is all from actual artificial selection or selective breeding. But how is selective breeding or artificial selection like natural selection? Well, this is a horse, Secretariat. It was one of the greatest horses of all time. He won the Belmont. He won the Triple Crown, if you know anything about horse racing. Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont, all in the same year. He was a 3-year-old, and he won the Belmont by the largest margin and the fastest time ever, and he won by 31 lengths. In other words, at the finish line, here he is, right? And everybody else back here are a bunch of losers. 31 lengths at least behind the front-running horse. Okay? Now, this horse was bred, actually, on purpose to run fast. So they mated his parents, and they do matings of different sires and dams, and the offspring, and sometimes they get an offspring that's very fast. Most of them are fast anyway because they're being bred for that, right? So how does this, though, relate actually to, let's say, what happens in nature? Well, let's take a look. Now, instead of a horse, we've got a zebra, right? And this zebra is running as fast as it can to get away from this this lion. Okay. Now, a winning zebra, in other words, the one with good genes, in other words, the fastest zebra out there, or at least the fastest zebra that's faster than the slowest zebra and can get away from the lion, is the winner. Okay? Some zebras are born and they're sub-zebras. They're not very good. They're the first ones that are going to get eaten by a lion. The ones that don't get eaten are going to survive. Okay? In other words, they're going to survive long enough to reproduce. And they're going to reproduce with other zebras that also are winning zebras that haven't been eaten yet. You're a losing zebra, you don't get to breed because you've already been eaten. You don't even get to have sex. Okay? Now, so being chased by a lion favors those who are swiftest. And those are the ones, the winners, who actually get to breed. Okay. And they produce fast zebras. Their offspring are faster than the ones that don't make it. The same thing is going on with the lion. In this case, not only is the lion causing the population of zebras to change into fast-running zebras, but these fast-running zebras are affecting lions. If you have a lion that has 5 aces, he's a very, very fast lion and is never going to have a problem finding a slower zebra to eat. And so that lion is going to survive and reproduce. There are some lions that are born to no fault of their own, and their cards are very bad, and they're not very fast. What's going to happen to those lions? They're going to starve to death. They're not going to produce offspring, and they're not going to breed. Okay? So, in a sense, the fast zebras are also causing only the swiftest lions to survive and reproduce, creating the population that's a very population of very fast lions. Okay, so this is what natural selection does. The environment disfavors certain traits that don't help an organism survive and reproduce, and favors those individuals that have those traits that do, and they leave more offspring. Okay, so instead of artificial selection, in other words, me breeding, picking who's going to, in terms of horses, who's going to breed, and I want to get the fastest horse out there. Instead of me doing that, nature is doing that. In this case, for the zebras, the lion is a selective force. He eats what zebra he can catch, usually the slowest or the oldest zebras out there. The only remaining zebras are the ones that are fast, and they're going to constitute the parents and then the offspring of the next generation. The same thing is happening on a lion. The zebras are actually the environment, natural environment, selecting for, in this case, faster lions. Slower lions don't eat well, they don't breed, they don't leave any offspring. Okay. Now, so natural selection is some force that affects whether an organism survives or reproduces. Okay? Now, evolution by natural selection is different. Evolution by natural selection is part of evolution in general. But you can actually have evolution changes in the population that have nothing to do with natural selection and nothing to do with a population becoming better fit to its environment. So, is it possible to have natural selection without evolution? In other words, can you still have evolution without natural selection? Yes. There are other forces of evolution, like genetic drift, that change allele frequencies in a population that have nothing to do with traits that help you survive or reproduce. And the population will change, but it doesn't mean that the population will be better fit to the environment. Okay. Is it possible to have natural selection without evolution? Yes. Okay. You can have natural selection where certain traits get passed on, but, well, certain traits survive. But if those traits aren't heritable to be passed on to the next generation, no evolution will happen. And you already know this from Darwinian snails. So what is evolution by natural selection? How is a lion chasing the zebra similar or different to selective breeding of the fast horse on the previous slide? The only difference is, instead of me selecting or a breeder selecting, it's the natural environment. And those individuals that have traits that allow them to survive and reproduce better than others in individuals who don't have those alleles or traits. They leave more offspring, they survive better, they breed, they leave more offspring. More of their genes are transferred to the next generations. And then is evolution restricted to biological populations? I want you to think about, we'll think about that in a second. Okay. So, what is evolution all about? First, it's really just about sex and death. Or actually, it's about survival and reproduction. Okay? But sex and death sounds better. It's all about sex and death. That's it. You can read that. Now, the currency of evolution by natural selection is evolutionary fitness. Okay? And evolutionary fitness is composed of two parts that act together. You have to survive, long enough to reproduce and reproduce successfully. In other words, hopefully lots of offspring, and lots of offspring with the traits that allow them to survive and reproduce successfully. So survival by itself is no big deal. As long as you survive to reproduce, you're going to be fine. You can think of an individual who, sometimes individuals who survive not as well, they still have higher fitness. You take some individual who, let's say some guy, he is a player, and he gets around and he ends up breeding and producing 30 children. Okay? The thing is, he does it by playing around. The last time he plays around, he's caught by, let's say, the husband of the wife who he's playing around with, and that husband kills him. Let's say he's only 21 years old, but he's already produced 30 offspring. Then you get someone, let's say like me, I have no offspring. I've survived into my 60s, right? I'm still here. We'll see for how much longer, but and yet in terms of evolution and fitness, evolutionary fitness, the 21-year-old with 30 offspring has me beat by a mile because I don't have any offspring and my genes are at a dead end. Okay. Now, it turns out that it's kind of interesting. People are obsessed with sex and death. We're terrified of dying for the most part, and we're always looking around for true love. Okay. Now, this is kind of, since evolutionary fitness is what affects how successful you are, an individual is in terms of the evolution game, it's the currency. Okay, it's kind of like the dollars that run. If I have lots of dollars, I'm going to produce lots of offspring. Okay, so, and that's the currency of evolution by natural selection. Those with more beneficial alleles survive longer because they have the right alleles and the right phenotype to survive, and they reproduce more successfully. That's the currency compared to other individuals who don't. Okay. So what is evolution by natural selection? Any consistent difference in survival and reproduction. We'll say survival and then reproduction, but ultimately reproduction. Successful reproduction of high fitness offspring among the genotypes or phenotypes of different classes of organisms or individuals within a population. Natural selection is the modifying force. It's like a sieve. If you know what a sieve is, think about panning for gold, where you have an open bottom thing with tiny squares, and little things, little bits of rock can get through, big bits are kept out. That's a sieve. The stuff that gets through is the successful part. The other part gets tossed away. Natural selection is the only mechanism that consistently favors traits that increase an individual's evolutionary fitness and a population's fitness. In other words, the only process that causes a population to evolve so that it is as fit as it can be to its environment. When a population is composed of individuals that are adapted, they have traits that help them survive and reproduce, they make up they constitute that population, and they're going to continue to produce offspring like that. If one of them comes along and gets a mutation, that in fact gives that individual specific offspring a leg up, then they're going to leave more offspring. And eventually the population is going to change and be composed of those individuals. So in adaptation, any trait that increases an organism's evolutionary fitness in a specific environment compared to an organism without, and populations then change and become better adapted because they're composed of those kinds of organisms with those traits. So individual evolutionary fitness affects the individual's ability to survive and reproduce, which controls the genetic contribution to the next generation that makes up the population. Okay. So, evolution by natural selection acts on individuals. Individuals do not change. Here we have beetles. We have green beetles and we have orange beetles. A beetle cannot change its color. It's born one way or the other. The color is the result of a protein pigment, and that protein, of course, is dependent on the alleles that the alleles that code for that pigment. Right. Okay? In this case, some individuals have traits that enhance survival. So we're only going to look at survival here. And some do not. So, which individuals are being selected by the environment? Well, these are crows, and for some reason, they like green. Maybe it's because it's easier to see the green in this background than the orange, something like that. But whatever is, they're eating the green. In other words, being green, you have low fitness. You don't survive. You get eaten. Generations later, what's happened? The population is now composed more of green, less of green, and more of orange. And then even later, because the crows really can't, let's say, see the orange ones, they're camouflaged, then the population eventually becomes all orange. And the crows are at a disadvantage, but the beetles are at an advantage because they survive and reproduce. And so, what are the individuals? The individuals are independent individual beetles, but the whole population is, let's say, at time 1, this is the whole population. Time 1. We'll say at time 2, this is the whole population. We can now see that the frequency of orange alleles has gone up in the population, and the genotypes that produce orange have gone up. And finally, we end up with time 3 population, third generation, and all the greens have been eaten up. They don't get to reproduce. They don't leave any offspring. All that left are alleles for the orange pigment and individuals who have genotypes that produce orange individuals. Okay? So selection is acting on each individual. Each crow eats an individual. In this case, they're eating mainly green, so he's a loser. And this other individual who's orange, like this one right here, he survives. He survives. He survives. These greens, they get taken away. Again, survival. This. More greens are taken away. And then finally, in other words, individuals are being selected. And then finally, in the end, there are no greens. There are only individuals who survive because they are camouflaged in the background. Is this population at times 3 the same as the population at times 1? No. Completely different in terms of the alleles and the frequencies of alleles between T1 and T3. There are many more green alleles than orange alleles. But that changes. So now, in terms of the population from time 1 to time 3 has evolved. It's evolved from time 1 to time 2. It's evolved from time 2 to time 3. In other words, the frequency or composition of the alleles in that population. Okay. If a lion eats you, is that natural selection? Question. Well, if a lion eats a zebra, is that natural selection? Yes. Are you an animal? Yes. Are you a zebra? No. Is a zebra an animal? Yes. Do lions eat animals? Yes. Can lions eat you? Yes. Is that natural selection? Okay. So, yes. Okay. If you get the girl or you get the boy and I don't, is that selection? Now, this is sexual selection, but think about it this way. It's not about surviving. It's about reproducing. If you get the girl or you get the boy and another individual doesn't, because you're cuter, you leave more offspring. So, is that an example of selection? Yes. If I bop you on the head and kill you, is that natural selection? Am I a living organism? Yes. Are you a living organism? Yes. Is a lion a living organism? Yes. Is a zebra a living organism? Yes. If a lion kills a zebra, is that natural selection? Yes. If I kill you, let's say, and I even eat you, is that natural selection? Of course it is. If a pine cone hits you on the head, is that natural selection? Well, it's not going to cause evolution by natural selection. Getting hit on the head by a pine cone is a random event. And we'll deal with that later when we come to genetic drift. Now, it's still selection. You're dead. You're not leaving your offspring. But it's not going to change the frequency of alleles in the future. Unless, of course, perhaps, if enough individuals get hit on the head with pine cones, certain individuals will avoid those places, and then that might lead to natural selection. If you get hit by a bus, is that natural selection? Well, actually, it kind of is. Okay? It's selection. Maybe not natural, but selection. You're taken out of the gene pool. Which of the previous might result in evolution by natural selection? Well, the lion, sexual selection, the girl. If I bop you on the head and kill you, well, individuals who don't get bopped on the head by me, who manage to turn the table, they survive, they produce. That's natural selection. Are humans still evolving? It turns out we are. Some humans are able to digest lactose in milk. Others are not. Not all individuals can. Before about 5,000 years ago, no humans could. Okay? Or if they could, it didn't do them any good because they didn't have access to milk after they were weaned. Okay, so humans are still evolving. Can you think of other things that might evolve? Do you think cars evolve? How about ideas evolve? Changes from one generation to the next, or from one model year to the next. Do cars change? Yes. Who's changing them? Humans, but actually selection. Why do you choose or buy the car that you buy compared to another car? Well, cars have different traits. One trait is some cars are more expensive than others. So, depending on how much money, you're likely to buy certain cars, cheaper cars versus others. Some cars get better mileage. That's like a trait. So, if we end up with a situation where there's less oil and gas costs more, cars that get better gas mileage do better. Those are going to be actually favored in the future because there's not enough gas, and they go further and less gas. So more people are going to buy them. Okay. Now, requirements for evolution by natural selection. These are the requirements. If you've done the Darwinian snails, you know this stuff. This is important. A population has to have variation. Okay? Here, variation. We've got brown and we've got green. Okay? The thing is, so if they were all green, it wouldn't matter. There's nowhere to go for the population. But if there's a mix of different colors, then those can get passed on. Those can be selected on. And then if there's heredity, so heredity and heritable variation is the stuff that selection acts on. Populations can only evolve if the variation can be inherited. In other words, if you have green parents, are you much more likely to give birth to green offspring? Okay? So the first two things you need variation and you need heritable variation. And then in terms of survival and reproduction, there has to be differential. In other words, some individuals survive and reproduce better, leave more offspring than others. And that difference is due to the heritable variation and the variants that are best suited to that environment. Okay? So, let's take a look at this. So here's differential reproduction on the bottom here. Now we've got a tree that's brown. We've got beetles that are green and brown. Who is getting eaten and who's not? Well, here's the heredity. We can actually see this. You can actually see the DNA in there. And we've got green, right? And we've got, I don't have brown, but we'll use black. Black. Okay? On a brown background, which ones are surviving? And, by the way, remember, the DNA affects the phenotype, whether you're green or brown. In this case, all these survive. All the green ones die, are eaten. This one's not going to be there for long. And over time, let's say we have a population like this at first. Now we have a different population. Allele frequencies, because alleles code for proteins, code for amino acids, right, and proteins and all that affect pigment, phenotype, selection, who's surviving and who's surviving long enough to reproduce. And then you have a population that it changes from T1 to T2. And now the only ones that are left over, because the whole population is now more fit, they all have camouflage. It's harder for this starling to actually detect a brown beetle. And some starlings are going to eventually find those brown beetles, but in general, the whole population is better adapted to its environment. Okay, so differential survival and reproduction. Evolution by natural selection gradually transforms populations over time, resulting in adaptation. Okay, so here's variation, right? Most individuals are short. Only this one is tall. Who's it going to be? Is this inheritance? Well, let's say being short and being tall is a heritable trait. If your parents were tall, you're likely to be tall. If your parents were short, you're likely to be short. Okay? So we've got those two. What's natural selection? Well, who's it going to be? Who's it going to be? Selection, in this case, is this farmer. That's the environment. And he's got an axe. And he's going to use this axe to start chopping off heads. Who is he going to probably chop off? I'm sorry, buddy. You're sticking out. Natural selection. Individuals with heritable variants best suited to the environment have higher fitness. In this case, they survive better, and they survive perhaps long enough to reproduce. Evolution by natural selection, even though selection is on this individual, eventually the population is transformed, and the whole population is better adapted to its environment, and that's adaptation. Okay, so this is an example of adaptations. This is a snake. It actually looks like a viper, and it blends in perfectly within its environment. What's it? What's an environment? Okay. If it was blue, it would stand out. Now, this is not sure the snake is being able to hide, but not necessarily hide from other predators, which might happen. It's actually, in this case, it's hiding from prey. Prey come along, like a mouse, doesn't see this, blends into the background, gets eaten. Okay. Adaptation. Well, these polar bears, they also are camouflaged, but they have other things. That fur is so dense that they can actually survive very well in the middle of winter in the Arctic. They can even swim easily in Arctic waters that are just a little bit above freezing. Okay? So they're not only adapted in terms of fitting in, but also it probably helps in terms of, it's harder to see them. Okay, it also might help in thermal regulation, and also it keeps them warm enough to survive the cold winters. More camouflage. This green leafed insect is camouflaged on this green leaf, so it's harder to see. This brown leafed insect, also camouflaged, harder to see. In terms of giraffe, if all the smaller animals eat all the lower, what vegetation is going to be eaten first? The vegetation lower down or higher up? The lower down, because not only do you have giraffes, but you've got gazelles, you've got impala, you've got buffalo, all kinds of different things eating the lower stuff. So having a long neck, especially when the dry season, when all the other vegetation has been eaten, allows you to survive, and individuals with necks that are not so long not to survive, and therefore not to reproduce. So this one goes, the other one survives. There are all kinds of different adaptations. Running fast, freezing and not being seen. Having acute hearing, beneficial, let's say. All kinds of different traits are adaptive in certain environments. Okay, so we've done this before already. We're going to go on from it, from the last lectures about antibiotic-resistant bacteria. You've got wild-type bacteria. Mutations come into the population. Bacteria reproduce, time 3. You still have wild type, you have red type, blue type, and a new one, yellow type. You add antibiotics to the environment. It kills everything except those red ones. They reproduce, and the next generation of the population is all red. Okay. We've done this before too. Same sort of thing. Peppered moth. The original wild type before coal use, and then more recently with pollution controls, is the light type had higher fitness. It was able to camouflage itself on the bark of trees, which is kind of variable like this. It was only when coal was building up on the tree trunks that they were then selected against, and these suddenly became higher fitness. They survived better. So fitness is always a function of that specific environment. What's a winning hand in one environment is a losing hand in the other. This is a winning hand. You can't even see it, but it's a moth that fades into the background, doesn't get eaten, survives. Here, that moth on a dark background, it suddenly has the worst hand. It's easiest to see, and it gets eaten. So, there is no such thing as perfect trait. One trait in one environment is perfect or very good enough to survive and reproduce. That same trait in a different environment is a disaster. Oh yeah, the same thing. Okay. Now, we've been talking mainly about survival, but there's more to, first of all, selection than just survival, let's say, of an individual from childhood to adulthood. Okay? So let's say we start at a zygote, that means a single cell that's made up, that was a fertilized egg, it starts dividing. If that zygote, if one of those, the sperm or the egg, had a bad mutation and it starts dividing, and that mutation was lethal, then you're going to end up with a dead zygote or a dead individual. That's called viability selection. Bad mutations, they're going to die before they even get a chance to adulthood. Let's say they were fine. Okay, good. They survive through adulthood. Now it's a matter of, do they find mates or not? This is sexual selection. If they find a good mate, right here, they mate, they become parents, they produce gametes. Okay? If, on the other hand, sexual selection, they're failures, they don't find mates, they survive just fine, but they're out of luck, then it doesn't matter how well they survive after that. If they don't reproduce, they're dead. Then, in terms of parents, there's selection on if the number of offspring you have is a function of alleles and genetics and the environment, then some individuals are going to leave more offspring than others that are healthy offspring. Okay? So now there's selection on parents that produce lots of offspring. Okay, lots and lots of offspring. And then it turns out that when they produce gametes, some gametes are better than others. Some sperm swim better. All kinds of different things. And then there's others. So in a life stage of going from a zygote dividing into an embryo, being born, then developing into an adult, and then breeding, there are different selective pressures during different life stages. Some phenotypes leave more offspring than others, ultimately. Okay, so selection on survival. Can you survive long enough to reproduce? We've already gone through this. This is T1, and this is T2. Selection against, right? And then the population changes. Myxomatosis. This is a virus. There were no bunnies or bunny rabbits or rabbits in Australia prior to English or other Europeans bringing them, English, to Australia. They brought bunnies. The rabbits bred like rabbits. There were tons of rabbits. The rabbits eventually, by the 1950s, had overrun everything, and they'd eaten all kinds of vegetation and left very little, not only for livestock, but of course for kangaroos and all those other things. So someone had a great idea. They thought they had discovered a virus from South America that killed European rabbits, to the point that it killed about 99.999%. Not like what we're going on now, but much worse. So they introduced myxomatosis right here, 1955. This is the population. What happened? The population of rabbits took a dive. Then, eventually over time, the population kind of recovered. There was a reciprocal selection going on, kind of like what goes on between a zebra and a lion, but in this case between a virus and the host of the virus, the rabbit. And in this case, eventually, the immune systems of rabbits, it only became 30% lethal. And the virus also became less virulent as well. Okay, so that's selection on survival. This is sexual selection. We'll get into this more in a bit, but males compete for females generally. Sometimes it's reversed. In some cases, it's both, like with humans. Okay, and in other cases, males, not only do they compete against each other, like here, but they compete in that they become more attractive. The female, in this case, not as brightly colored as a male, says, oh, this male is beautiful, I'll mate with him, and not some other male. Okay, so we'll get to that. And then this is an example of fecundity selection. This plant produces many, 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 many seeds. Another plant, perhaps because of genetics or some other thing, produces very few seeds. Who's going to leave more offspring in the future generations that grow up and do the same thing? The plant that produces many seeds. So that's fecundity. That's the number of offspring. Okay.